Sophie teaches at Macquarie Uni, where her current research focuses on the urban forest. Hear her discuss her findings on what species have been used as street trees in urban areas of Melbourne and Sydney and the effects on biodiversity. As part of the 5-year inter-uni project Which Tree Where, this work has implications for councils in choosing which species to plant in a future of climate change.
It's really, really nice to be able to talk to you today about my work. It's mostly any person who writes a thesis, it's their best dream to have a captive audience to talk to about what they're passionate about thinking about. And it's so nice to be in company of people who love plants. We're a rare breed, I think, as far as many, you probably can sympathise with that. And you having experience with native trees and planting, I'm really open to any questions or any suggestions, because this is really just the beginning of my plant journey. But in May, I submitted my thesis through Macquarie Uni, and it's essentially comparing the trees that were in Sydney before cities were constructed to the trees that we now use in our street tree plantings. And I'm trying to see what the difference in species is, but also the difference in function, the different services that the trees bring to cities. I don't know if anyone has connections with Macquarie Uni, but this is my lovely, lovely supervisor up in the top right-hand corner. Her name is Rachel Gallagher, and she's a plant conservationist, a person after your own heart, I guess. She's now an associate professor at Western Sydney University, but she's done a huge amount of different work, notably very recently to do with strategizing bushfire recovery for threatened species. So she's very knowledgeable about plants generally. And then there's my supervisor, my secondary supervisor, Alessandro, who's more of an urban ecologist. He's very clued into this really rapidly expanding field of urban ecology and building novel urban ecosystems within urban areas. And this thesis was completed through Macquarie Uni under the Which Plant Where program, which is a huge five-year program that's been looking at, it's sort of tying into climate proofing our cities and working out what selection of traits and plant features are recorded within cities and what the resilience is of our city trees to climate change. They're creating an incredible online tool that everyone will be able to use soon. You'll be able to look for a species, one of 2,500 in their app, and find out all of its different traits and where it might best be planted with regard to like lots of urban obstacles like power lines and underground infrastructure and all that kind of stuff. So without further ado, I'll launch into this. Everyone amongst us who lives in a city, and even those who don't, know that urbanisation is due to massively impact the biodiversity that we see. Cities, when they're constructed by their very nature, plough on through nature as we know it and create dwellings that humans need to occupy to create a city. And as cities grow, they expand out into our precious nature areas and they transform them, sometimes partially, sometimes wholly, until they're completely unrecognizable. And in addition to that, cities are densifying. So even where we had pockets of land that had lovely vegetation, it's slowly being eaten away. And I'm sure there are people here who are actively involved in trying to conserve that as best as possible. What is good about cities, though, is because we've got such a diversity of structure and a diversity of places, there's a huge capacity for cities to foster an enormous species diversity. So in addition to the plants that were already living in the area, lots of things come in and can actually make use of the conditions of cities, of the strange aridity and the lack of water and the high phosphorus soils and strange nutrient concentrations. Like, things will find a way to live, as I'm sure you know. And the expansion of cities and the expansion of street trees has a really interesting history. And it starts with big drives from the early days of the herbarium, where street trees were chosen based on the various characteristics of cities, botanists would think about the geology and rainfall of the climatic variation of the area that they were looking to plant in, but they were also hugely informed by prestige and fashion and planting trends from all over the world. People saw gorgeous lines of your plane trees and wanted to see them and in all their deciduous beauty all throughout cities. And that's greatly informed a lot of the plantings that we see in cities today, and essentially drives the diversity that we see. I might not show this video. It's a sped up version of what Sydney's expansion looks like. Can people see that video? Thumbs up. This is just showing the rate at which Sydney has expanded. And oh, good, thanks, Dorothy. And we've got this tiny, tiny city, and then we hit a certain point and we just start exploding. And all those plant communities that were there have been either eroded or completely gazumped by urban sprawl. There's a lot of historical context here that I'm sure you could add if you wanted to. And that's like the slow march of development and urbanisation that's driving the diversity that we see all over the place. But I'm focusing on street trees today. So you might be aware of this term, but the idea of an urban forest is used a lot in the industry at the moment, and it encapsulates anything that's a plant that lives in a city, even if it's in a crack in the footpath, even if it's pot plants in the backyard. It's absolutely everything that's green and growing in the city space. And there's an explosion of research in this area at the moment, looking at an array of different things. In my case, I'm looking at species diversity, but many people are looking at the capacity of trees to cool and drastically reduce pedestrian areas and mitigate the vulnerabilities of people who are facing heat within cities, all the way to cleaning and purifying air, or conversely messing with the atmospheric, messing with breathable air, becoming problematic to humans. There's an incredible diversity of urban forestry research in them at the moment, and it's really informing how we're using city green space and how we can best adapt our green space and our street trees to serve humans and serve non-human living things from now into the future, so that cities are healthy. They're not just a huge concrete wastelands. They're hybridized dynamic spaces that have a lot going on and can do a lot of things simultaneously. So as you're walking around your southern suburbs of Sydney, you'd probably come across some of the street trees that are really common. And one of the most common species that we see is Elaphostomum confertus, our lovely brush box. Then we've got the Eucalyptus leucoxylon, another one that's a common offender. And these trees themselves aren't in and of themselves bad, but the frequency with which we plant them can present problems for us. If we as street tree managers plant the same tree over and over and over again, it leaves our precious urban forest very open to climate change as well as pathogens. And should something sweep through that affects the brush box, it means we've got a huge sizable proportion of our street tree population that is decimated. And so part and parcel of street tree selection now into the future, in terms of ensuring climate change resilience and resilience to pests, would be sowing diversity into street tree and other urban forest plantings. And throughout the world, another feature of urban forests is the loss of native species, and I'm sure a lot of you can identify with this. All throughout the world, people are doing research looking at what was before cities, what we see now, and what we've lost and gained in that process. A lot of the time, we've lost huge amounts of native species that may still be existing outside of cities, but they've been lost from part of their native range in cities. And this is happening all over the world, from Adelaide to New York to the Czech Republic, all the way to Italy. It's everywhere in cities. And then in terms of how planting of street trees works in our cities, we are often faced with populations that are dominated by like a high proportion of the population is one species or one genera or one family. And that's the case throughout Sydney and Melbourne, but it's variable, and there's varying attention to how much diversity needs to exist in the urban forest. So, for example, you've got in North Sydney huge rows of Callistemon vinalis, like the one you can see down the bottom right here, as well as large proportions of the Platanus species, and 80% of the genera that are planted, of all the species that are planted in North Sydney, 80% are just from 20 genera, and a lot of them would be from the Myrtaceae family or the gum family. And that in terms of street tree diversity is too high a representation. What City of Melbourne, who are industry leaders in sort of urban forestry planning, would recommend is no more than 5% representation by one species, no more than 10% representation by one genera, and no more than 20% representation by one family. So in all of these different LGAs, we've got a bit of work to do in terms of diversifying the species that we see. And then this is the part that I'm most interested in, and it's the diversity of function. So in a city, you can list as many species as you like. You can create long lists of how many species you see and how many of each species you see, but it doesn't necessarily encapsulate just the degree of diversity of features that you can see in a plant population. And this is a really interesting and new field in the world of urban forestry, is looking at just how many functions we encounter when just in amongst the street trees that we live amongst, or any trees really. I've got some lovely colleagues who are at the moment doing she's doing a PhD looking at floral phenology and flower symmetry, and that gives a really good indication of the kinds of pollinators and the pollination and seed dispersal strategy that plants in certain environments will use. It's very informative in terms of telling us what plants do to survive and the diversity of strategies that they pull out and grow to be able to thrive and strive within cities. It also tells us a lot about what's a successful kind of strategy for a plant in a city. In some places that are more arid, there is a higher diversity of those plants that have sort of adapted photosynthetic strategies. So instead of photosynthesizing during the day, they'll often photosynthesize at night. And that in some cities has been seen as a selective force. It's more common in some cities because of urbanized processes. And this is why adding the kinds of functions that plants have, like the kinds of flowers that they have, the sort of rooting structures they have, how long they flower for, what sort of salt tolerance strategies they use, is really useful to know how plants are surviving and how they can thrive in cities. And I'm fascinated in this. So that's my background. That's the background to the research. I'll go into what I did in a moment, but does anyone have any questions or reflections as we're going along?
Ralph just asked a question on the chat line about how does photosynthesis happen at night with no sunlight?
I can get you some diagrams that focus on that. It's a kind of physiological and chemical process that allows plants to transpire at different rates and open their stomata at different times and compartmentalize the chemical reactions that allow them to capture carbon. It's it's longer term than I have time to address right now, but I can get you some resources.
Yeah. Okay, so it's quite complicated.
Yeah.
Okay.
But it's a cool strategy. Anyone else? I'll go in that case. So my research has, as I think I addressed just earlier, I'm looking to compare, or what I did was compare two different groups of plants, and these are the terms I'll use for the rest of the presentation just to guide you through it. So I'm comparing the native species, so those that are locally native to Sydney and Melbourne in this case, across those two cities, or the species that were here before cities were constructed. And I'm comparing them to a second pool of trees, which is all the street trees that are planted throughout Sydney and Melbourne. And what I want to sort of know is what native species have been left out and what new species have been added, which plants are locally native and also used as street trees, whether there's a difference in the kinds of functions that these plants, or well, the sort of the features of these plants within between those two groups, to see if we've had a loss of functionality or a gain of new function. I lost that last question. And that's what I'll be interrogating. So, I mean, you all know what Australia looks like. But just to remind you, because we've been locked inside for so long, maybe you've forgotten. I know I kind of have. So with these two maps, everything that's highlighted in yellow, those are the LGAs that I have data from. So I've got a great contact at Sutherlandshire, actually, who gave me some fantastic street tree data. She's very passionate about her work down there. You're very lucky to be in Sutherland. You're in really good hands in terms of urban forestry. And each one of those little purple dots is a native tree occurrence. And I've sourced that from the virtual herbarium, which is just herbarium data from all over the world and Australia, and coordinates of where those specimens have been recorded. And I'm comparing these two. So in terms of my results, this first kind of bar up the top is, where's my cursor? There it is. So I found altogether there were 870 species, including both native and planted. But 59 of the species that are native to Sydney and Melbourne are missing from street tree plantings. 131 of them are shared. So that's where a locally native species has been used as a street tree. And then a whole 680 of them, new species have been added. And looking at those a few slides ago when we were having a look at the different cities and how many species are added there, that's a pretty common pattern. We see that in most cities. And if we look over on the far right here, I've got a couple of examples of species that have been lost, species that have been retained, and those that have been added, some of the more common ones. And one of my favourites is the one that's in the background here, the Upamatial arena. It's such a beautiful tree, native to Sydney, but not a street tree. And we might discuss why in a little bit. Now, I'll ask you to sort of be a bit patient with me with this part, because this is where the analysis gets a little bit weird in one word. So I was talking before about functional diversity, which is the idea of giving a plant a signature based on its various features, giving it more information beyond its species name. And this diagram over here, it's an incredible piece of research by a lady from South America who took as many plants as she could find throughout the whole world and got features of each of them and saw how they related to each other and how all of them were distributed in this sort of multidimensional space. But what this picture is really telling us is we've got two distinct we have these two distinct red areas. And what that's showing us is there are two distinct kinds of strategies that plants will use to survive within an ecosystem. They might have a strategy that's driven to that involves like larger seeds, larger leaves, and height, being tall, or they might have really tiny leaves, quite small seeds, and quite a small and reinforced growth form. And that's an alternate strategy altogether. And for my research, I've used three of these traits to try and understand the diversity of strategy that we see used by trees in cities. And they have different relevances. The leaf area, the extent of the leaf area, or the smallness of the leaf area that a tree will have, relates to how it deals with temperature and water unavailability. So, for example, plants that are within very cold areas or within very arid areas will often have really, really tiny leaves that are quite thick, and that's an adaptation to temperature and extreme extreme. And that's almost a representative of one of these red circles in the left here. Whereas some of our tropical plants, where there's a high competition for light and just less of that extreme of temperature and water availability, may be in a position to have enormous leaves. They may be fighting for light. They may have that as an adaptation for water runoff, but it's a distinct opposite or different kind of manifestation of that leaf area trait. I hope I'm making sense for you all. I know that functional trait ecology took me a little while to get my head around. And then height and seed mass also have their different advantages and disadvantages. Having large seeds like a coconut will be good in some ways, but maybe not other ways, whereas having small seeds might allow you to disperse really far, but might also mean that you're more susceptible to being eaten or being lost or being buried and unable to reach the surface to germinate. So these traits tell us a lot about how a plant lives in its ecosystem, and the sort of strategies it uses to function there is the real take-home message here. So for every single street tree and every single locally native tree, I got these three pieces of data. I got how much area their average leaf has, what their average seed mass is, and what the maximum height of the tree is at maturity. And then I took all of these and imagine that every species just has a signature based on these three traits. This is a bit mad. And what I then did was I put them in this kind of cloud of data. And the cloud of data is telling me how all of these trees relate to each other. Every little purple dot there is a native tree, and every yellow dot is a street tree. And what this spinning cube, which is totally crazy, but it's actually my favorite of all of my figures that I've created. What it's telling you is how all of those tree species relate to each other based on those three traits that I've collected data for. You'll have to bear with me for a second. I just need to go back, but I'm not quite sure how. There we go, previous. And so if you look at this sort of cube, you can see that there are these clusters, like you've got big clusters of all of that, of these yellow dots, whereas you've got a bit more of a sparse sort of cloud of these purple dots that are the native species. And that's a key outcome of what I've found. So in terms of that strategy that a plant will use, i.e. the combination of its seed mass, its maximum height and its leaf area, what I've found is amongst the species that were planted in that are locally native to cities, there's a huge diversity of sorts of combinations of strategies that they will use to utilize their environment. Whereas among the street trees, they often have a really similar combination of strategies. And there are a few reasons that this might be. Unlike in natural ecosystems, where you can sort of infer a plant strategy a bit by its local environment and its native environment conditions and the other trees that it competes with and other species it competes with. When it comes to ecosystems that humans manufacture in cities, the driving forces are really different to what they are in native areas. They're often a lot to do with what humans select, what they perceive that they need, what they have access to, what the urban restrictions are to a tree's capacity to thrive. But often it really comes down to decisions of people. And what we sort of decided from this research is a likely cause for there being a strong similarity between the trees that we choose to plant in cities is because humans select them to be a certain way. So some summary pieces of information from my work are that 30% of the species that were locally native, the tree species that were locally native to Sydney and Melbourne, aren't used in street tree plantings. And this may be for a number of reasons. While 680 new species have been added, and some of these are native to Australia more broadly, but a whole bunch of them are from overseas, and not only from overseas, but they have populations across many continents. So they're very common throughout the world. They're not representative of particularly rare species. And also, though there are 3 times more species in the street tree populations or communities, it doesn't mean that there's more diversity of function. And you have just as much diversity of function amongst native species as you would amongst planted street trees. And this is because the street trees that we plant are all quite similar to each other in some parts. The similarities are that they're a lot shorter than native species a lot of the time, and they have similar seed sizes. We don't necessarily have the extremes that you would see in the native species composition. We're missing these, the key feature here is we're missing tall trees. People don't want to plant tall trees because they get in the way of power lines and they get into our underground infrastructure and they drop branches and they're seen as a little bit scary, but we miss them, but we need them. But I guess on the flip side, we're missing 30% of our native species, but there might be a reason that this is the case. During my thesis work, I was able to trawl through the local government grade literature to see what their various approaches are to diversifying their urban forests. And some, if not a majority of the strategies that I've read through often show a bit of a bias against native species. There's almost an unwritten bias against them because they're sometimes perceived as not being able to thrive in an urban environment where the conditions that they would have been used to before a city are no longer there, and they're vastly modified. But what I wanted to have a look at was whether that is necessarily the case. We all know that native species are incredibly diverse. They come from a lot of different families. And though a lot of the native species that we see in the street tree populations or in our native populations are from the Myrtaceae or the gum family, or Fabaceae. They're some of our key species. We still have a huge diversity within those families and outside of those families. And so it's really hard to draw a huge blanket conclusion across all native species and say that they can't be planting candidates. And the research group that I'm a part of, Which Plant Where, is actively interrogating that to find amongst trees what might be candidates that are native and also viable as street trees. So we're almost there. For some of the species that were missing, that are locally native to cities but are missing from the street tree plantings, I've tried to have a look at what their tolerance is to different temperatures across their range. So if you have a look at, say, this top left map of Australia, every orange dot here is an occurrence of the Leptospermum grandifolium, which is a native plant that's missing from street tree plantings. And its range, though it extends up into Sydney, is really far more towards the south. It's towards areas that are a lot cooler. And what you would imagine is if you planted it in Sydney, bearing in mind that Sydney's going to get warmer as we experience climate change, it might not face the ravages of heat, whereas it might be better as a candidate down in Melbourne. And that also might explain why it's missing from the street tree population. It just might not survive. And that's fair enough. Whereas if we're going to look at something over here, like the Emmenosperma alphatenoides, and if anyone has an alternative pronunciation for that, I'm happy to hear it. It has all of these orange dots on the bottom left Australia. They spread all the way up into the north of Queensland. And that might show that they could be ideal candidates for introduction into Sydney street tree plantings. And indeed, they use them in some places in the Illawarra. And what's even more interesting, I hope you're still interested in this because I know I am. What's even more interesting about that is some of these species that are both invasive, non-native, and very, very common as street tree plantings, like the camphor laurel, are very similar in the kinds of traits that they have to this missing Australian native species. And what I'm proposing ultimately as an outcome to this is we might look at the camphor laurel, see where we'd have it and where we like it, and maybe interchange it with this other one that's really quite similar and is also we can see that it looks like it might withstand cities quite viably based on its climate tolerance. And then finally, building on this information and trying to inform the sort of street tree palettes that we have to diversify those. There's a bit of a process for that, but this kind of analysis could be really handy for addressing some of our more pressing urban issues. So say you're near a freeway or you're near a train line and you're finding that you're experiencing pretty bad air quality. You might want to have a look at the features of the plants, those functional traits that relate to a plant's ability to filter the air or move air particulate matter around more effectively, or capture pollution on its leaf surface and intercept pollutants. So you might want to list the kinds of traits that relate to a tree's ability to perform that function in a city, and then you could input a bunch of trees to see what sort of breadth of strategy they use with respect to that need, with respect to the need to purify air. And if you have a breadth of diversity amongst those trees, then you're on the right track in terms of being able to provide that function in a city. But that's sort of what I'm working on now in my workplace, I guess, is like trying to at a very baseline level, bring some of this diversity information into how we plant up our cities and our city street trees, and move beyond like listing the number of species that we see, but also looking at the sort of features that they have, and trying to build more diversity in terms of features of trees beyond just species, but also species that are going to survive in a city and do what we need them to do to make cities livable places. Anyway, I've spoken for a while now. I'd love to hear what you have to say. I think I may have gone on a little bit longer than I should have, actually. But if you have any questions, I'd love to hear them. I hope you found this interesting and I made it straightforward enough to be useful, I guess.
No, thank you very much, Sophie. That was excellent.
Oh, thank you.
Do we have questions?
If you enjoyed this video, why not subscribe and view other great content? New videos being added all the time.